Thanks to everyone for joining us. My name is Damaso Reyes, and I am the investigative editor at the New York Amsterdam News. And I want to welcome you to our discussion, Hard Labor, the Fight for Inclusion in the Skilled Trades. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a few moments, but I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do. So if you haven't already read our series, which is 4 articles, which looks at different aspects of the fight to diversify and integrate the construction and skilled trades, please do. You can visit our website at amsterdamnews.com and see our articles. You can also feel free to share your questions for our panelists in the Q&A, and we will leave some time for that towards the end. Some quick housekeeping. Please, if you aren't already, subscribe to our week daily newsletter, Editorially Black, and you can go to amsterdamnews.com/product/subscription to get in your inbox every morning our top stories about what's going on in our community. I think you'll find it highly interesting. And if you are interested in the work that we are doing, I am the editor of our Blacklight Investigative Unit, and we are the first investigative unit at a legacy Black newspaper. So we would love for you to follow our work. You can also visit us on the web at amsterdamnews.com/blacklight. But this project here that brings us all together was a Blacklight initiative. So we'd love to have you learn more about our reporting. Again, if you haven't had a chance to read our stories, please visit amsterdamnews.com/hardlabor. I think you'll find the work interesting. All of the panelists here were interviewed and quoted among many other experts for the series. And I think after this conversation, you'll probably find them as enlightening as I did. And you'll find the history that they have to share really, really interesting. And that's the end of our housekeeping. So we're going to get started in right now. And I wanted to start with this quote by A. Philip Randolph, the great African-American labor organizer, which actually starts the first article in our series. And I found it, as I was doing research, as I was doing reporting, it really resonated for me, this quote, which says, "At the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization." For me, that quote resonated because the fight to diversify the skilled trades, to make them more inclusive, was very much a fight. And it took a lot of organization by A. Philip Randolph and a lot of other people, as we're going to learn about in our conversation. So we're looking forward to talking about that and to hopefully hearing from our audience who maybe have some experience with this process as well. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing one of our panelists, Dr. Trevor Griffey. He is a lecturer at USCLA. He is the co-founder of the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, and he's a scholar of labor history. He's also the co-editor of Black Power at Work, Community Control, Affirmative Action in the Construction Industry, which was published by Cornell Press in 2010. Dr. Griffey, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. My understanding is I'm going to sort of introduce myself rather than the history itself that I think your series documents very well. I was especially appreciative of the work that you did with Professor William Jones to document the longer history of racism in American labor markets and racism in labor unions, to sort of set up the story that you do on contemporary issues. And so while happy to talk about that history, I just thought I'd introduce myself. I'll post a few links into the chat. I don't know if I can post to everyone, but I can post to hosts and panelists, and that can then be reposted by the primary host to all. But the short of it is I'll just give a quick intellectual biography on how I came to study these issues, because it wasn't intentionally. I didn't go into graduate school thinking I'm going to write a book about attempts to desegregate the construction industry. What happened is I lived in Seattle. I had written about issues related to racial justice for a number of years. When I went to graduate school, I returned to a number of people that I had met as journalists and started doing oral histories as part of understanding movements for racial justice in the Seattle area. And I met a remarkable group of African-American construction workers who were sort of, along with Harlem Fight Back and a few other organizations in the 1960s, one of the best organized and most militant group of rank and file Black workers who really sought to do an inside-outside strategy in their labor organizing. Tyree Scott and the United Construction Workers Association were Black contractors who had been excluded from the construction industry because of their race, and were marginalized as contractors also because of their race. So they didn't have a lot of high capital and other things that you would need for big projects. And their attempts to bid on war on poverty funded construction and their frustration with that led them, along with inspiration they took from movement activists around the country, in New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago in particular, but lots of other places, to start occupying construction sites, shutting down construction, bringing hundreds and sometimes thousands of people to construction sites, literally marching on the tarmac at SeaTac Airport to stop the flights coming in and out of the airport briefly, all in the name of saying that, sort of in the language of the times, freedom now, but segregation now. No more promises, no more postponement. They wanted immediate representation of skilled tradespeople to be more diverse. And they wanted this as part of an economic strategy to control community development more broadly. And so, I think I see Damaso talking. So I may be...
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in really, really quickly, because I do want to talk about that era, but I also want to talk about the sort of post-World War II era, the sort of just in the 1960s, just when the Civil Rights Act gets passed, which is this watershed legislation, which in theory allowed for and promised access to all sorts of industry, and ended, in a legal sense, discrimination in all trades, including the construction trades, that we talk about and highlight in our first article. But we talked to you for this article, and you mentioned that the skilled trades were a flashpoint for protests in the 60s. And I'm quoting you directly now. And you said that it had been long simmering because as African Americans gained access to the military, they gained the trades that they would not be able to get through racially restrictive apprentice programs. Then they would go apply and be dispatched, but they couldn't get jobs either through the hiring halls, as well as they couldn't get union membership. Can you talk a little bit about this 1960s era and how it then sort of set in motion the changes that we're still experiencing and living through now?
I can. How long do you want me to talk for, though? In some
I
ways, I thought we were going around doing intros.
Yes, we are. So I want you to give us sort of the TLDR version of this, and we'll circle back and we'll talk more about this. Obviously, this is a very rich topic that people have written entire dissertations on, but we only have an hour.
Yeah, never ask a grad student what their dissertation is on. Never ask an academic what their book is about, unless you're ready. Like they don't have the elevator talks ready. But here's what I'll try to do: is I'll say that as part of these oral histories, I've gained an enormous appreciation for labor activism. I was not a labor historian, and this was a pivot for me. It was rank and file workers seeing in their collective action the power to change the world and feeling like they partly did so. As I was doing this work, an article came out that I still think is fairly definitive on the subject in relation to the topics that you've asked about. It's by the historian Thomas Segru, and he talks about the long Black freedom struggle in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to try to desegregate skilled trades in general and to desegregate the building trades in particular. You're exactly right that the federal government plays an enormous role. That because the federal government had the power to regulate labor relations as a result of the New Deal, it now had the power theoretically to prohibit racial discrimination, but it didn't have the political will to do so. And because more people enlist in the military becomes a bigger part of the federal government. Now you have more people gaining job skills that previously they might not have access to. And then the third piece is the war on poverty. The federal government invests billions of dollars in redeveloping urban communities that have been historically segregated. And now it is bringing predominantly all white workforces into those neighborhoods to build buildings named after prominent civil rights icons. And the offensiveness of that and sort of the structural contradictions within it absolutely made this a flashpoint for labor activism in the 60s. And also, I should note, labor law existed, anti-discrimination law existed in the United States well before Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, starting with the Fair Employment Practices Commission at the national level and their various state laws. There had long been policies in different states, not in the South, obviously, for individual workers to complain that they were being discriminated against on the basis of race and to seek redress. The problem is the enforcement was unbelievably weak because the political will to change racial segregation simply wasn't there. But what it meant, though, is that when Congress passed Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, they assumed that the enforcement was going to be about as weak as it had been at the state level, except for some activists. And so the key thing to know about the construction trades is these protests at construction sites in the 60s are at the vanguard of attempts to enforce civil rights law anywhere. That they are saying zero is not enough to simply say you are race blind in your hiring practices and then have a racially segregated outcome in your hiring practices became on its face in response to these protests seen as insufficient and requiring corrective remedies that came to be associated with affirmative action. So this is the origin of affirmative action law in the United States in terms of it getting real teeth. The only thing I would say that my scholarship adds to this is suggesting that whereas Tom Segru talks about sort of longer campaigns for desegregation and anti-discrimination, because of this being a protest-led movement and community-based, I and a number of scholars have also argued that the Black Power movement played a key role in this. And they had a somewhat different vision for affirmative action that was a lot more about autonomous Black economic development and community control. And so that was always also part of this debate. And so
thank you.
Yes,
thank you for
hope that
helps. This is a great segue to Jeff Grabelski, who is the co-director of the National Labor Leadership Institute at Cornell. He develops and delivers education and training programs and provides research and technical assistance in all aspects of union affairs. And the programs he has worked on have reached over 300,000 unionists nationwide. Thank you so much for joining us. We quote you in our second article, and you say something really interesting about this sort of same time period, and I'd love to expand on it a little bit more. You told us that, quote, there was a time in New York City, which is where the Amsterdam News is based, when some major unions in a city that was becoming majority minority, where there were local unions without a single Black member. As Dr. Griffey points out, this would be sort of post federal legislation, but this de facto segregation, active segregation, even in places considered progressive and integrated like New York City, continued for some time. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that happened, as well as the sort of direct action responses that began to topple these walls and these obstacles to integration?
Yes, and thanks so much for allowing me to join this conversation and be part of the panel. First, let me begin with a note in the interest of full disclosure. I approached this question not as kind of an impartial academic observer, but as an active player. I have been a longtime member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, worked as a union electrician for many years. And I just want to start out by saying that my union, the IBEW, and the building trades have been very good to me and my family in good times and bad, and we've had plenty of both. And so I approach this question as an insider in a way, and with someone who feels a great deal of love and loyalty to my union. At the same time, I should say that I got involved in the labor movement in the early 1970s, coming out of the movements of the 60s, which are so central to the question that you're raising. And I began working and organizing in the steel industry because I came to believe that it would be impossible to build a more just society and a fair economy without building a more powerful and progressive labor movement. And finally, I would say that the quote that you started with from A. Philip Randolph, which is really a very useful way to start the articles and to enter this conversation, really speaks to a theory of change, which I embrace. And that is when we're faced with the reality of systemic and historical racism and racial discrimination, there are a lot of interventions that may be necessary to disrupt that system. But fundamentally, what's needed is a broad social movement that is at its heart disruptive. And so I think that's what this period of time in the 60s is all about and why it is so critical. I think there are two things that contributed to the resistance and intransigence of building trades unions to the obviously righteous and fair demands for full and fair access to these union careers that were expanding in the 1960s in a building boom and that were denied to the communities of color in cities like New York and Philadelphia and Seattle and Chicago and across the country. And I think the two factors were, one, the history of race and racial discrimination and racism within building trades unions historically, which your articles speak to very clearly. And on the other hand, a particular dynamic in the building trades, which is a singular focus on securing jobs for current members who are dependent on those jobs to support their families and oftentimes resistant to bringing new members in for fear that those new members would compete for a limited number of jobs. And it's really important for us to understand that that's part of the context here. And in the period of time that you're referring to in the 1960s, I mean, one example of which is identified in Trevor's terrific book, which I recommend folks to read to understand this period of time. One example is the sheet metal workers in New York City, Local 28, which had 3,000 members and not a single Black member. And in order to disrupt that reality, it would take more than legislation. It would take more than regulation. It would require a social movement that fundamentally disrupted the industry. And I think that's really what the story is fundamentally about. I'd also say that it's important for us to recognize the significant progress that has been made since that time as a result of the sacrifices and the courage of Black activists to demand opening up these opportunities within the building trades. And one just to think about is Sheet Metal Workers Local 28 in New York, which in the 1960s didn't have a single Black member And more recently, their director of training and apprenticeship was an African-American woman, Leah Rambo, who was a beneficiary of these efforts on the part of activists to breach the racial barriers within the building trades, and benefited the union. I mean, the union actually grew significantly by embracing, after having fought and literally bankrupting the union in resistance to demands for integration and inclusion. So I think that this is a story of kind of labor history that reveals that there is no labor history in this country separate and apart from the history of slavery and racism and racial discrimination. Those two histories are inseparable, they're intertwined. And I think to Trevor's point and to the question that you initially raised, it's interesting how the construction industry was a place that became a flashpoint for this struggle for civil rights and for opportunity and for inclusion.
Thank you for that. So our next two panelists, as we continue on our labor journey, were quoted in our fourth article. And as we're getting reminded in the chat, please, if you have any questions, comments, observations, please put those in the Q&A. But I want to pivot to Mr. William Wallace IV, who I believe is a multi-generational, maybe third or fourth generation Harlemite, in addition to being the senior acquisitions officer at the Continuum Company. As a developer, he has been a fierce advocate for diversity in the construction and skilled trades, with over 30 years of real estate development experience. Mr. Wallace, thank you so much for joining us. In my conversations with people I've interviewed, experts, as well as a lot of union members, they've often cited developers as being a roadblock to diversity, a roadblock to union labor. You're an African-American developer who has worked hard to do just the opposite. Can you talk a little bit about why diversifying the construction and skilled trades is so important to you as a professional, as someone who makes money by building things?
Thank you, Damaso. I appreciate the invitation, and I have to completely concur with all of the very trenchant points that my predecessors made in the presentation. I had a different start than most people. I started my career as a law clerk in Brooklyn Supreme Court. And at the time I began, my father was a judge in New York, and my plan was for me to become a judge as well. I saw that every person that came before me, regardless of the race, ethnicity, religion, everyone that came before us in the criminal term. Civil term was fascinating and intellectually stimulating, but the criminal term was extremely depressing because everyone that came before me was either poor, uneducated, or unemployed. Everyone. And so I recognized the beginning and commencement of a huge renaissance economically in downtown Brooklyn to rebuild downtown Brooklyn, that access to those business and employment opportunities was something that was an opportunity we could not ignore. Now, you have to remember, developers are normally on the other side of the table, because you're right, it's about the bottom line. One of the problems has been they have been inordinately empowered because there is a lack of leadership and advocacy for trade unions, not for unions, but for trade unions in our elected officials and in our clergy, which is normally historically where most of our activist support has come from in the Black community. That's due in part for, I think, two reasons. One, previous speakers alluded to, the whole history of American racism and exclusion, and that being obviously reflected in the building and construction trades like most other unions. The other, and that's where New York kind of differs from the rest of the country, is that if you recall, Damaso, and I'm third generation Harlemite, but you've been in New York for a skinny minute, building construction trades were controlled by organized crime. Let's be very candid here. And so there was very little ability to get into those trades, to coalitions. I go way back. And so it would have been impossible to have entry to that without completely turning it on its head. That has changed. And don't want to, anthropomorphize a movement by personifying it, but the person who was most responsible for that change has been Gary LaBarbera. When he's come on, he's almost embraced the concept of inclusion, almost embraced the need to have this industry reflective. Now, I raise my history in the criminal justice system because unlike most other areas of industry or commerce, the building and construction trades actually welcomes people who have criminal records. And in my community, that is an inordinate amount of people. So when you have young brothers and sisters seeking to get a fresh start, and they cannot get employed in government, and they cannot get employed in the private sector, the construction trades does not have that barrier. And so it's critically important that we begin to access those opportunities. The second challenge, because things always evolve, most change is not revolutionary, but evolutionary, is that now New York City is no longer a union town. The rules have changed. So if we were to get the advocacy, because I don't think I challenge anyone on this webinar to name an elected official whose singular mission is to empower building and construction trades unions in our community. Name one clergy member. No. And that's partly because of the history of the union movement in the building and construction trades. And because of that, there has been no historic sense. 1199, Transit Workers Union, DC 37 have always been advocated for on behalf of our elected officials, not so for building and construction trades. And I think because of that lack of advocacy, things have changed in the marketplace where there's now almost no residential development that is done union. So I come from this from a perspective that's personal and political, third generation Harlemite, being a former law clerk, seeing what this can mean for my community. But because there are very few people of color in the development industry, that attitude, philosophy, policy, and advocacy is not shared across the board.
Thank you for that. That's really powerful, and I think a really important perspective to share with our audience. I'm not going to say that I saved the best for last, but I'll let you draw your own implications. I want to welcome Nicole Bertrand, who's the Executive Vice President at the Edward J. Malloy Initiative for Construction Skills. The initiative's pre-apprenticeship training program helps to open the door to New York City residents seeking entry into the unionized building and construction trades. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been hearing and talking and explicating some of the history. For us, it's really important to talk about solutions, not just the problems. We definitely want to understand how we got here, but we also want to talk about how we move forward and how we change the dynamic that has developed. And the work that you and your colleagues have been doing for many years now is helping to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the initiative and its programs and the impact that they're having on the building trades movement, the unionized movement, as well as the larger construction industry in New York?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I learned a lot just now. I learn from Jeff almost every time I meet him or see him, but that was a very informative session we had, and I was very appreciative of the history. And I think it would be remiss of me not to mention that my father was a member of the Young Lords Party, and my mother was in the Puerto Rican Student Union. So that is my background, and maybe why I ended up working for a nonprofit that prepared.
I had no idea until you just said that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, well, it was relevant to share that. But the Construction Skills is a nonprofit organization that was founded by the Building and Construction Trades Council and the Building Trades Employers Association in 2001. And so the original intention was to begin offering these opportunities for preparation and access to unionized apprenticeship to New York City public high school seniors. That is still our main focus, but since Hurricane Sandy, actually, we made an adults program a regular occurrence into the services that we provide. And the overall apprenticeship readiness piece, we actually, I'm sorry, kind of all over, but 2020 called a lot of things into question, right? One of the challenges that we had was to continue serving our students during that time. And the biggest or most impactful thing that we were able to do was to upgrade our curriculum to the multi-craft core curriculum, which is a national certification out of North America's building trades unions. The MC3 is offered asynchronously, which at the time was required because everyone was locked down. So that transition in 2020 has continued into right now. And so what we're offering is apprenticeship readiness preparation or program, ARP, to both high school students and adult residents in separate cycles. But that preparation leads to direct entry access to unionized apprenticeship. And one of the, just listening to everything, like we still hear the same things, like, how come, you're not serving this particular area of the city? How come, it's a small program? How come you're not, and the quote that's in the article, I was surprised that was the quote, but the quote for me is, the narrative persists that we help people enter into apprenticeship, but we don't help them complete apprenticeship, or the industry doesn't enable them to complete apprenticeship. So one of the biggest numbers that we like to float is the journey person number. We have almost, I think the number is almost 1,200 journey persons since we started in 2001. And that is, when you think about what it takes to offer this opportunity and lift somebody up, that's talking about adding people to the middle class. And that's what we're doing. That's what this program is. It's designed to help people access this pathway and to impact their lives and their families' lives overall. So the Mr. Wallace mentioned Gary LaBarbera, that's my boss. And you're exactly right. I think that is a big part of, he's big personality, big person, really invested. And when he is invested in something, other people listen. And that's his skill as one of his skills as a labor leader, is to get people to listen and agree to go in that direction. And that's really been impactful for construction skills. And that segues me into what we also formed in 2020 is the Apprenticeship Readiness Collective. And that is the 4 programs in New York City that serve New York City residents, and some programs offer training to residents outside of New York City. But the focus is New York City. I don't know if somebody, are you not, well, I have background stuff, sorry. So the Apprenticeship Readiness Collective, or ARC, is a horizontal collective formally endorsed by the Building and Construction Trades Council. And the reason we formed the collective, it's for sovereign organizations. We're for private nonprofits, right? We all have our own thing. We serve our own populations, right? The 4 affiliates of ARC are construction skills, non-traditional employment for women, helmets to hard hats, and pathways to apprenticeship. And those 4 affiliates are serving different sectors of the entire New York City demographic makeup. And each has its own focus and different skills that are offered. But the access is the same. We are all working towards providing that access to different sectors of the population. So the ARC, one of the motivations behind formalizing ARC was to raise the profile of direct entry as a tool to be leveraged by affiliates of the Building and Construction Trades Council to increase their commitment and numbers with regard to diversity and inclusion. So those are 2 big things that have happened in the last 3 years, and that are, I guess we haven't measured the impact quite yet, but the immediate impact is that We are increasing the numbers, affecting different populations, unifying our missions, and bringing together our shared goals to the same end.
Thank you for that. And I just want to highlight that in the article, we mentioned that nearly 90% of the participants in your initiative, in your various programs, are members of a minority community. So that's really important to highlight. And Nicole, you touched upon something briefly in that fourth article that we talk about, is that when we widen our perspective, there are still challenges for apprentices of color nationally. The work that your organization does is, perhaps the A level. I think part of the challenge is that not everyone has access to a program as high quality and sort of dedicated to that union route as yours. And that's one of the things where I think it's really important to bring you as a representative of your organization, because you are an example of an organization that's doing it correctly, right? That's really rooted in the community, rooting to try to create a middle-class path, unionized pathway. And unfortunately, especially if we look at the American South, not all apprentice programs do that. So I think it's an important distinction to draw, and that not all apprentice programs or pre-apprentice programs are constructed equally. Forgive the pun. So we really value the work that your organization is doing, because it is so remarkable even within the larger industry of construction and pre-apprentice programs. So now that we've done our first round of conversations, I think we can maybe take a little bit of time to dig a little bit deeper on some of what got alluded to, some of what got talked about. There was a mention, and it's something that we talk about really briefly in our series, but that several of the people that we spoke to mentioned, is this idea that, especially in New York City, that the construction industry was for a long time controlled by organized crime, and that was another barrier to entry. And that was something that people and community organizers who were doing direct action had to reckon with. Jeff, do you want to speak a little bit to that, or Trevor?
I'm happy to defer to Trevor if he has some insights about that question. The one thing that I would say is that is a significant barrier and a significant problem in those both trades and sectors of the industry where there was a significant presence of organized crime. And just like significant progress has been made in addressing the issue of inclusion and diversity within the trades, significant progress has been made in cleaning up the industry, but it's an ongoing issue. At the same time, I would say that it's important, while recognizing that as a barrier, that it was not the exclusive barrier, it was not the most necessarily the most significant barrier, and it shouldn't be used as an excuse for the trades to focus on what do we actually control and to what extent are we embracing these righteous demands for full and fair access to unionized careers in the construction industry. So I don't want to kind of deflect the question, but I really want to focus on what is it that the question that you raised about what is it that we can do to move forward and make significant progress. And I'd like to speak to that for a moment, if I may, because I think the starting point for that is drawing a distinction between jobs and careers. Because what often happened in the 1960s were demands, quite understandable demands, on the part of communities of color to get access to jobs that they saw in their communities. And what often happened, and those who've studied the history can elaborate on this more, is a developer or a contractor would hire someone in the community and put a broom in their hand on the job, and they would have a job on that project. And then when that project ended, they would put that out on the street.
100%.
And what's critical to understand about the construction industry is that there's a variable demand for labor. You get on a project, you do the project, and from the day you get there, you're working to get unemployed when the project is over. What's really important is to get access to lifetime careers where you're able to get training, certification, and the opportunity to work on multiple projects within the jurisdiction of your union. And that's precisely what these construction skills programs that Nicole was speaking to provide, access to those lifetime careers. Now, let me make an important point about the critical role that building trades unions play in our industry. Because on the one hand, there's a variable demand for labor, so it's important that building trades unions have a pool of labor to dispatch to contractors when they need skilled workers. But the other thing is that building trades unions through the collective bargaining process provide for industry-wide training to ensure the human capital pool of the industry is replenished over time. And that's really what communities need access to, are those training programs that lead to certification and the opportunity to work on multiple projects within the jurisdiction, like within the 5 boroughs, for example. So just finally, and I see that you have a follow-up. Let me just make one final point here, and that is leadership really matters. People have spoken to that. And the leadership within the building trades in the 1960s represented a barrier to really thinking through how do we create full and fair access to these lifetime careers. And leadership matters today when you have someone like Gary LaBarbera and leaders of the affiliates, the various who are embracing this approach to a more inclusive philosophy and practice within the trades. Those leaders are critically important to make things happen. And this is not rocket science. That's really the last point I want to make. What we need to do is build a pipeline where community organizations are doing the outreach and recruitment of individuals who want to get lifetime careers in the construction industry. And you need pre-apprenticeship programs like the one that Nicole helps run that provides the soft skills and the access and the support to get members of the community into union apprenticeship programs. And you need union apprenticeship programs that are prepared to welcome these new members into those programs. And you need unions to support those workers when they get out of those apprenticeship programs. And you need contractors and developers who are part of the same pipeline, who are providing opportunities for employment within the unionized sector.
100%.
This is a full pipeline. There's not like one piece of that that can work without the other pieces. And what's critically important, to come back to the point finally that Brother Wallace raised, is in order for these programs to work and in order for these opportunities to be realized, we need to grow the union market. There needs to be more opportunities for workers to work on union projects. We need more projects under collective bargaining agreements that are investing in the United States literally billions of dollars. This is the largest training and skills upgrading program in the United States, with the exception of the US military. And all of these programs are supported by private capital that's generated through the collective bargaining process. So we need to grow the union market to grow those opportunities on the demand side. And we need programs like construction skills and others that provide access on the supply side. It's doable. It requires people who are committed, who are of goodwill, who are creative, and recognize that this is morally right to do and strategically smart if you want to grow the union market.
Yeah, Damaso, I just have to, I mean, Jeff was 10,000% correct, 10,000% correct. In addition to, because all of the entities he mentioned, I think are on the right track. Now that Gary's there, and he's right, the other trades, the 28 people in that executive council, they're all moving forward. We have to look in the mirror, going back to the quote that you started this webinar with, being at the table. When you're constructing something in the Bronx, and every one of those elected officials is coming to the District Council of Carpenters, the Local 3, Jeff's alumni, begging for re-election donations, where are you advocating for my community? Why are you allowing that construction to proceed? In Brooklyn, why are you allowing non-union construction to proceed? We cannot have, a lot of times, we are who we are based on our status with another person. I'm a parent because I have a child. I'm a teacher because I have a student. I'm an employee because I have an employer. Someone who has put to work and now is building needs to be able to be given that opportunity to hire union labor, and someone who's at the table crafting those projects needs to insist, because when I talked about the bifurcation of the union movement, construction versus non-construction, there are projects, and my hat off to these brothers, they've been an effective dynamite union, and I adore Kyle Bragg, but you cannot get a project through New York City without 32BJ being a part of it. Hats off to him. You can do that with the construction trades, and you should not be able to do that, particularly with the demographic change and the opportunity that presents for our community. Last point, because there's a synergy. I just talked about the status and our relationships depending on the others. We in our communities cannot demonize development, because you can't have increased minority participation on professional levels, architects, engineers, contractors, if you don't want to build anything, or if you see a crane and you're running for cover. What you do is demand inclusive and fair development and have us be part of that rebuilding of our own community, as opposed to having non-union contractors pay brothers and sisters 33 cents on the dollar, do exactly what Jeff talked about, having no trade, no security, no benefits, no health care, and no job after they're tossed to the corner after being a flagger. We have to look in the mirror and galvanize our advocates to make this happen, because the union movement under Gary's leadership and everyone in this panel is prepared to do it. We now need someone at that table that A. Philip Randolph talked about to make sure it happens.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Trevor. I actually wanted to pivot back to Nicole really briefly, and then I want us to take one or two questions if we have the time. One of the things that has been echoed here is this idea, and it's something that Gary LaBarbera told us in our article, this idea that we don't create jobs, we create careers. Can you talk about how that mantra shapes the work that your organization does and the way that you partner with both unions and the development industry and the construction industry to make that a reality?
Sure. So I think as I was listening to Mr. Wallace speak and Mr. Bilowski speak, just thinking more about the sort of like on the ground piece of it with regard to the demands for labor and who is going to be filling those seats and what new industries and certifications are going to be required to meet those demands. Things like offshore wind, that's still a mystery to me at least. But the impact that we have is that we're still preparing people, but we need everyone to understand it's not just, respect Jeff, it's not just electricians. Everybody wants to be an electrician, right? But there are 24 other programs in New York City that offer the same training and education and certification opportunities. So I think that, I'm sorry, Damaso, I kind of lost your question, but
no problem. I was just asking you about this idea of a job versus a career and how that helps you to or focuses the way you partner with unions as well as developers and contractors.
So we don't partner with developers and contractors. Construction Skills doesn't. The building trades, of course, does. But Construction Skills partners with New York City public high schools and other community-based organizations to recruit participants into our program. And the biggest part of this whole thing, everyone has already said it. This is not a job where you work. It's not a temp job. It's not an internship. It's not you can go to this one job and then when we're, like Mr. Wallace said, when we're done with you, goodbye. The investment in union labor is that this is a skilled workforce. This is a protected workforce that is being paid fairly and working in safe conditions and can go home in one piece to their families every night. So we've sort of mentioned the non-union sector. That's not the same that truth is not the same reality for the non-union sector. Those are the people that are most vulnerable and are the ones who are not able to, the ones that are only offered a job, not a career. So the career piece, when you talk about a career, it's like, do I have somewhere to go almost all the time? Right? It's not an office. It's projects that are being built within the jurisdiction of your union, right? In New York City, that's all 5 boroughs. That's where we place our folks. And some unions extend all the way up to, I don't know, upstate somewhere, and all the way out to the end of Long Island. So there's a large area that where people can work. Most of the work is in the city, but we are facing challenges. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it benefits the industry to make diversity front and center. Make diversity front and center. And also the people that are, especially for our youth program, to your point about job versus career, the people that the gatekeepers, right, who are telling apprentices about, or telling high school students about these opportunities, don't really know anything about registered apprenticeship or how that works, or how that how they can offer that opportunity to their students. So the job versus career is so significant to our industry, but really all industries. This is not a minimum wage job. This is a career opportunity that can afford you a middle-class lifestyle.
Thank you for that. And I want to take our remaining time to answer at least one of the questions from our audience. And so I'm going to pose this to the panel. And if we have time, we'll try to get to the second question. An anonymous attendee asked, mentioned that this conversation is focused on increasing jobs for marginalized folks. They ask, what is the state of marginalized ownership in the construction trades? What are the challenges and opportunities for Black-owned trade contractors? And I'll just throw that to the panel, whoever wants to, has a perspective on that, maybe Mr. Wallace. I don't know if Dr. Griffey does.
It's an excellent question. And it kind of goes back to the point I raised about having opportunities. If there is no construction in minority communities, or completely non-union construction in minority communities, there is no market for minority contractors. There is no market for minority architects. There is no market for minority engineers. So when you have elected officials increasing goal aspirations, 10%, 15%, 20%, wonderful. Where are the businesses if you're going to demonize construction? If everything that's proposed is shot down, or it's the developers get out of town, I mean, there are bad people in all trades. I'm an attorney, but they're horrible lawyers, they're horrible teachers, and they're wonderful lawyers and wonderful teachers, and they're wonderful developers who want to do the right thing.
Mr. Wallace, can I jump in and ask you, if more developers worked with the community, worked with unionized labor, do you think that some of that reflexive antagonism would disappear?
100%, but developers are not going to be the people to carry that flag. I am an aberration. It's going to take the normal sources of leadership, elected officials, clergy, and community. Everyone has to say, before we talk about where you're building and what your design looks like, is this going to be a union job? If it's not, go back to the table. That's not happening in our community.
That's a great point. Dr. Griffey, you've been waiting very patiently. Let's hear it from you.
Yeah, I'd just say I support what William and Jeff are saying, which is if you channel people into an apprenticeship program, but then your industry is largely non-union, non-apprentice based, guess what? Your pathway's over and you've just de-skilled part of your workforce and you've turned a lot of jobs into gigs. What I want to emphasize historically, and this sometimes gets left out of the stories that just focus on the protest part, the open space for this conversation to happen, is that the deunionization of construction didn't happen accidentally. It was a sort of triple whammy of unions wasting their resources opposing desegregation, so that weakened them. But then there was a massive business assault on the labor movement in the 70s and 80s that blamed them for inflation. Just as we see teachers' unions being blamed for government spending too much, saying, well, if we just had a bunch of low-wage teachers, like maybe we wouldn't have to tax the rich more. you have the same arguments happening about, oh, we just restart the economy if we just had like cheaper construction projects. But yeah, well, what kind of economy does that produce? And so you talked about the mob in New York City trades. The mob is booted out of New York City trades, not because there was some moral objection to the mob, though that's part of it. It was because they were shaking down contractors for so much money that basically they got sick of it, and they just were like, we got to get rid of these folks because they're preventing us from building stuff, or they're, in some cases, as we've seen in some projects, they're using really cheap materials and it's harming us. But the gist of it is our whole system now is addicted to this cheap construction labor, and as a result, it pits contractors and unions over, well, who's got a more diverse workforce. But the bigger issue is not just diversity, it's living wage jobs, kind of developing the careers, et cetera. And to do that, we really need to push back against both Democrats and Republicans who have come to think that a series of low wage temp jobs, sometimes relying on exploiting and abusing undocumented workers. I'm not opposed to undocumented work, but their legal position means they can be hyper exploited in ways that drive down wages and things. Like, if we're not addressing those things, we're not creating the pathways that you all are talking about. And so I just wanted to flag that is sort of this major lurking issue, because unless we have almost like semi-socialist federal government spending priorities to provide enough public sector jobs, we're going to rely on the private sector, and therefore the unionization of the private sector has to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you for that. And we are about at time. As I suspected, we had more to talk about than we had time to talk about it. But I want to thank all of our panelists, Nicole, Jeff, Trevor, and William, for their perspectives. If you want to read more about this issue, if you want to learn more, if you want to hear more from these panelists, please visit our project website and read these articles and learn more about this really important issue. We're going to continue to do labor reporting over the years, so we want to hear from you. What are the stories that we need to tell? How can we better serve you as a community? I also want to end by thanking the Solutions Journalism Network, which provided funding for this project as well as for this webinar. And we thank you for tuning in and for taking some time out of your day to chat with us. So thanks to everyone who participate, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.